We're here on March 31st, general and housing. It's been a very long week, but I wanted to be able to fit in these bill introductions for today and really start focusing on the second half. Still not what?
Still not hearing. I'm not seeing.
Sorry.
What's that? All right, so let's start again. All right, so we have a handful of bills that we're going to hear from. The first four are grouped together as labor bills, an important part of our portfolio. And then we're going to hear from Senator Harrison at the end about, is she going to talk about this 103?
And JRS 17.
All right, so JRS 17 came to us a week or so ago, and as did S 103. S 103 is a discrimination bill. It includes language that we've passed a couple of different times in each the House and Senate, but never in the same year. So we'll hear from her. And then she also has this joint resolution urging U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to comply with the expedited asylum hearing provisions of the Afghan Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2022. So with that, we have Representative Peter Anthony up first with H 454. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Chairman Stevens. For the record, Representative Peter Anthony, Barre City. My proposal is in the form of a short form, H 454. It's a quintessential labor bill in the sense that it tests the resolve of what's called in the trade the community of interest amongst different occupations and positions. It is focused on adjunct faculty, specifically in the Vermont State College system, of which, by the way, I'm an alum. As you probably know from COVID, a lot of online instruction has become necessary. The state colleges have gone into this, and then the question is for them, since they have had a collective bargaining agreement with faculty for over 40 years, back in the 70s is when the AFT first organized the VSC, started with the full-time faculty, added the adjunct faculty much more recently, but still in the last decade. And now, if you will, there emerges a cadre of online folks, some nearby, some not. The VSC has benefited from a decision by the VLRB, which recognizes online as different in the sense of community of interest and bargaining unit. We think this is wrong. What it may tend to do, in fact, is make it impossible for adjunct faculty who are online to organize, for the simple reason that nothing in the current environment would keep the VSC from exporting those jobs and having online instructors anywhere in the world, quite frankly. And that's important to us, both for the good of the Vermont economy, but also I think it really goes to the heart of the idea of community of interest. It's fine if you want to have adjunct faculty as opposed to full-timers. I understand that. I was a chairperson of a board, a department at the VSC. I hired adjuncts. I know all about that. It's great flexibility and covers course areas that you may not want to commit a full-time person with benefits to. I'm perfectly happy with that. The adjuncts at the VSC, as I said, have been organized for a long time. We being the AFT, and I think people who believe in collective bargaining, as does the legislature, after all, they legislated it as a right in most public employees. We want to respect the idea of community interest. And if the VSC and the Labor Board want to essentially treat online people as different, though they're adjunct, just like the folks who teach in person are adjunct, We think that that's not a wise direction to go in. It really does strike at the heart of what otherwise is a commitment to collective bargaining. And as I say, this is not new. The VSC has been organized for over 40 years, back in the 70s. There is one correction, and I'll take responsibility for that. What we want to see is simply two bargaining units. The VSC adjuncts, that includes all the campuses, but not CCV. We understand that CCV does have distinct programs, is locationally, if you like, diverse, but the campus-based programs, whether they're online or in person, should be a single bargaining unit. So where you see Vermont Technical College, my mistake, should be CCV. In other words, CCV has a bargaining unit, and what now is called Vermont State University. I refer to the old name because that's where I come from. But regardless, adjuncts who are employed by the system, but not CCV, are one whole bargaining unit, regardless of which campus they work on, what their telephone number is, et cetera, et cetera. That's our proposal. So the two bargaining units.
It's not creating a delineation between online and in person. It's just saying if you're adjunct, you're adjunct.
You're adjunct. Yeah, that's the idea. And frankly, the terms and conditions should be identical. The obligations seem to be, whether you're online or not, you have to be accessible to students. You have to be a resource. Yes, you don't participate in governance issues like the full-time faculty. We understand that. And that's why there's a separate bargaining unit for adjuncts, regardless of where you are in the system, but for CCV, which is unique for sure.
If we take it up, we could certainly make sure that's clear. Just a bit of background. You used the phrase community of interest as a delineation between, and that's when we talk about bargaining units. There may be, and I don't know if this is true for Vermont State Colleges. I know it's more true for UVM, where there's full-time faculty, adjunct faculty. They're separate. They have each one has a community of interest. Secretaries, administrative assistants have a different community of interest. I mean, and custodians and service workers different. I just want to point out that it's not so easy to say that everybody in one place is in the same union.
Yeah.
Certainly not in the same bargaining units. And so that's what you're asking us to clarify here for adjuncts, online adjuncts in particular in CCB. When was the decision? Do you know offhand when?
I believe it was within the last 2 years. It's very recent. I only learned of it recently, and then I crafted this bill saying this really is a departure, if you like, from the tradition. As you pointed out, the full-time, the adjunct folks, the custodians, the support staff, all of those are different community of interest, and they have different bargaining units. And frankly, they are not all represented by the AFT. They may have different union representation as well. So that's none of that's unusual. It's just dividing, if you like. Some adjuncts go to the door to the left and some adjuncts go to the right. Really, I think is a departure from the tradition and the commitment, if you like, to collective bargaining as it's been known for a century.
So committee, again, just as a reminder, we've only had a couple of days of labor testimony
I was going to say, it may need a tutorial for that. I'm not sure.
We've had the new director of the Labor Relations Board in, and under what act, do you know offhand, under what act the state colleges are organized?
I do not.
Okay, we'll get that information.
Yeah.
So again, the state can only mostly write labor law. I think we'll have an exception to that at some point, about state employees or public sector.
They are considered state employees, and we've had access. I was a grievance counselor for about 15 years. We had access to the VLRB for eons since we were organized in the 70s.
So that's our bailiwick with respect to.
Yeah, we're not private sector, if that's what you're. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to just remind us it's been a while. This is our first major union oriented. We've had a couple training days, but just this is the first legislation that we're really hearing that is public sector union. So any further questions for Representative Anthony? Thank you for introducing.
I thank you. And again, if you want, there's a flyer from the AFT essentially describing what two-tiered amongst the adjuncts could portend, which is not helpful.
And was that provided to our electronically?
I can do that.
Yeah,
Please do, just put it under Peter's.
our president of AFT, Heather Reamer, has it. So,
Representative Burrows.
oh, sorry.
How many adjuncts are there at the moment in the system?
I would defer to Heather in the unit.
Heather Reamer, AFT Vermont Director. It changes a lot because there is the way people come in and out of the unit. I think, and so I don't know for sure, but most of them are in the regular bargaining unit of the part-timers, and I think it's 80 to 100. And those people are also teaching in person or online. That's what's also kind of confusing about this, is we have some people teaching online in the regular part-time bargaining unit, and some people teaching online on a special little NVU online carve-out. So, but I think there's about 30 in the NVU online and about 100, but I can get those exact numbers for you.
Thank you.
And just, you use the phrase part-time, and I'm going to focus the question to Peter, of course, but just, so again, if everybody should know what adjunct means in the academic world, it's as close to the gig economy as it gets. They have very few rights. They're paid what they're offered. There's very little job protection, and so on. And so what kind of organizing is available does offer some of the job protections, and if we've heard this right, that especially the online only adjunct instructors are zero job protection.
Yeah. So
Okay.
the wider world, it's community of interest. As a practical matter, it's unfortunately a drag on the pay and benefit level for the folks who have been organized for quite some time.
Well, thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, committee, and Tom. Have a nice weekend, you all. Boy, it's been a long week.
Next up, in perfect timing, Representative Hooper from Burlington arrived to talk about H292, an act relating to providing workers' compensation coverage for post-traumatic stress disorder suffered by certain public employees. And I'll just point out in advance that H297 has a very similar title, and we'll be hearing from our Representative Mulvaney Stanley, who's on call. Is that right? So, Representative Hooper, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee members.
Point out your badge, your name tag is just, I'm sorry, it's just Hooper.
I'm Representative Robert Hooper from Chittenden 18. Yeah, they charged by the letter, so I decided to go the economic way. The bill that I am here to talk about, workers' compensation, effectively expands the horizon of people that would be eligible due to PTSD from the current pool to now the general category of state employee and judicial employees. We're finding more and more different categories of individuals are getting subject to work-related PTSD, both because of staffing levels and what seems to have been a massive increase in the poor behavior of our fellow citizens. And particularly in courts where similar to, I think, what we did 2 years ago with hospitals and firearms, Although you can't generally get into a courthouse with a firearm, you can with your fists or anything else that you can pick up. And assaults, et cetera, are escalating. The same as during the pandemic, we had social workers and probation officers and a bunch of other people going into people's homes, already a stressful situation. And that stress is conveyed to the person who's doing the job, some of which are pretty stressful to begin with. So it basically just opens the door a little bit wider. The other bill that is coming before you from the other representative from Burlington specifies more job titles, where my bill just basically throws it open to a broad spectrum, and any of those people in that spectrum that are found eligible would get the benefit, basically.
So this is currently PTSD is not considered, work-related PTSD is not considered as something that can be checked off in a box in terms of workers' compensation.
I think it's pretty difficult for a lot of job titles. I mean, historically, I think we have legislated to some degree. Job titles are so blatantly obvious that it's that level of stress. To say we have missed a few would be an understatement.
And in this particular case, again, work-related, let me ask this question, and again, this may be more than just a sponsorship introduction, and an HR person here too, but the diagnosis of PTSD, would that be related to an individual's private doctor? Would that be subject to an HR department? Would that be subject to an EAP? Would that, do you know offhand?
I think that workers' comp board makes a determination based upon physicians that they either use or have, or in some circumstances accept referrals. Sort of like, I mean, Social Security disability is sort of the same way. You can go to one of the doctors recommended by the disability board, or you can have a strong statement from your treating physician, which carries a lot of weight.
So without having looked at the bill, does this make changes to all 7 or 5 applicable acts? Or is that, when you say certain public employees, does the bill delineate between,
Falling off.
what's that?
I can't hear you.
I'm sorry, I haven't read your bill yet.
Okay.
But does the idea here that providing the coverage, would this be placed in every single public sector union act, or is this, when you say certain employees, are you specifying the Department of Corrections or?
No, the other bill specifies more job title related. Mine is broader in character and goes by overall sort of, if you're a state employee, you fall under legislative description of what that is. If you're a judicial employee, you fall under a description of what that is. And then that just opens the first door for you to apply for other, for lack of a better term.
Okay. Yes.
It says,
I
police
didn't,
officer, rescuer, ambulance worker, firefighter, state employee, or judiciary employee.
yes, and the two things at the end are the ones that I'm adding.
I've got a question about PTSD, which is a subject matter with which I'm acutely familiar. But sometimes PTSD goes or often PTSD goes undiagnosed and then becomes more acute with the next event. If a person is, how, according to this bill, how do you think that should be handled? If a person may have had PTSD prior to an event that took place on the job?
I think that's more towards the rulemaking than it is to the subject matter of this bill to some degree. I mean, there's always the possibility, excuse me, that somebody comes to you with a problem, and what happens on the job exacerbates that problem. So, you know, that's a reasonable consideration, I think, for anybody that's making an adjudication on whether a claim is valid or not. If the shock and whatever of the job experience that you have does that cumulative effect of making the PTSD so prevalent or debilitating that you can't work anymore, that's a professional medical decision.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions for Representative Cooper right now? Because we'll follow these up with walkthroughs and get a further understanding of
Cool.
the details, but I appreciate you bringing this forward. And again, post-pandemic, I think, again, we've not, I'm sorry, it's not post-pandemic, I keep saying that, it's but what we've seen, of course, is not so much an increase of PTSD as much as it is an increase in the awareness of what that means.
Things like chemical sensitivity and a lot of other health issues, this is somewhat a product of a more oppressive, refined, whatever the word you want to use, society, and it's going to be coming before us a lot more than it has in the past. I think about the first demonstrated example of PTSD that I ever saw was when I was probably 6 years old, and there was a World War I veteran in my little town that did nothing but walk around all day. And he wouldn't speak to anybody, he had his head down, and the term back then was he was shell shocked. And I think that's where we are evolution wise at this point. A lot more shells out there, and they aren't all armaments.
Yeah, we've taken testimony on PTSD in the past with respect to military PTSD and how difficult, and it was tied into testimony relating to military suicides.
Yeah.
This is some years ago now, but what struck me then was in an event, let's just say an IED explodes near you, that one of the pieces of testimony we took is that it's almost like your body and your brain and your senses take in on a 360-degree way what that experience was, but you have no idea which degree is going to be the one that is. The example that someone used was when they were in theater, one of the things they saw right before the explosion was a kid on the bicycle going the other direction. It wasn't related to the bombing, as it might be in a movie or something, but it was just a kid. And when the veteran came home and saw a kid on the bicycle biking, he just saw it at the same angle and just realized that he had no idea, like he survived, the veteran obviously survived the explosion, but he had no idea whether the child survived the explosion. And that was the 1 degree that he was, just went right into his soul. And
I think that the general category PTSD, the nomenclature is a hodgepodge of a bunch of different mental processing sort of disorders, and there are treatments evolving, ERMD, things like that have a tendency to try to get your brain caught up with what your eyes have seen, but it's still a very young science and hard to get your head around.
figuratively and literally.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Representative. And now we are visited by Representative Casey from Montpelier, who's going to talk about page 338, which is an act relating to granting certain employees the right to strike. And so this is well, you will fill us in, I'm sure, a little bit on the history of striking or what's allowed and not allowed in our statute. So welcome.
Sure. Thanks very much for having me today. Connor Casey for the record. There's probably smarter people in the room than I am for some more specific questions, but I was working in labor a good portion of my life. I was the legislative director of VSEA for about 8 years before moving out of state for a brief hiatus. So this is a bill. It's actually literally just a one sentence bill, really, because currently state employees, both in SELRA, the State Employees Labor Relation Act, and JELRA, the Judiciary Labor Relations Act, are explicitly prohibited from doing a workplace action like striking, recognizing a picket line, walking off the job. It's different for public employees than it is for the private sector. Private sectors are covered by the National Labor Relations Act. And as such, all private sector employees are given the right to strike. You've seen this recently very, very close to home with Goddard down the road. And you see a lot of it in the private sector with Starbucks these days. So, obviously these employees for the most part are covered under a contract. VSEA would have some of the bigger ones with the non-management unit there. Heather Reamer's in the room there, AFT with the state colleges, and I believe UVM is covered under the State Employee Labor Relations Act as well. So they have contracts in place, but contracts don't necessarily give you the full protections that you need. I want to give you an example, and some of you might remember this. Back in 2008, I was representing workers down at the Bennington State Office building. The building was about 140 workers, and 8 of them were diagnosed with a very rare disease called sarcoidosis. Affects 1 out of every 20,000 people. We had 8 in a building of 140. Your organs start to deteriorate with sarcoidosis. Mortality rate's pretty high. We've lost a couple of those people since. But there's no really known cause of sarcoidosis. There at least wasn't at that time. I don't know if they've caught up since. But we brought the epidemiologist down and they said, okay, they don't all go to the same doctor. They don't all live on the same street. The kids don't go to the same school necessarily, but they all work in this office building. There's something in this building, something up here. The administration really, I thought, was quite insensitive to it at the time. People were crying going to work each day and knowing that if they didn't go to work, they would lose their jobs, but they had to, and they knew maybe they were getting sick. So that would have been an example of a time when a workplace action would have been very appropriate to have people walk off the job, draw attention to this, say this is intolerable, but there was nothing we could do with the contract. We had to come to the legislature. And it's ironic I'm on institutions right now because we went to institutions and had them tear that building down, thank God, So I think of that as one example, but there's a lot of examples. You have 800 vacancies in state government right now. I'm sure you could pick a number of intolerable work conditions. But that said, strikes are extremely rare in the public sector, extremely rare. And when they happen for a very short duration. Vermont, we have teachers have the right to strike. You just don't see it happen too much, right? Because when you're giving up your wages, you're taking such a risk, you're putting yourself out there so much just for maybe the chance that something would change. It doesn't mean it's going to change, but just for the chance. So some states, Alaska, California, Colorado, Hawaii, Illinois, Louisiana, Minnesota, Montana, Ohio, Oregon, and Pennsylvania have given public employees, state employees, the right to strike here. Just recognizing that, it'd be extremely rare to see a government shutdown or anything like that. But, I do feel like it is a tool that's needed. And, I've seen a few examples of this. And sometimes you just need to get your issue out there. And, a strike might be a bit provocative, but I think it's the only way to do it in some cases. So brought this bill up and, I think it's drafted differently in different states. Some would exempt sort of essential workers, like, correctional officers or, maybe law enforcement. So there's a number of ways you could do it, but decided to keep it really simple for the introduction here and just strike out 2 sentences there. So that's sort of the gist of it.
Representative Eldon.
Thanks for the bill intro. I just want to, so I'm looking at, this bill's repealing two sections of law, basically, or, yeah. So performance of his or her official duties, right? That seems to be what's currently prohibited, is striking while in the performance of official duties. I'm imagining, I'm having trouble imagining it, honestly. It's like, does that mean if someone wants to walk out of work, they're barred from taking part in a protest because they were at work early? It seems to me that if they walk out of work, they're not doing their duties. So I'm just trying to understand where the rubber hits the road. What does the existing statute, because I understand your bill would repeal these parts of the statute,
Yep.
what's it actually preclude? Like, it's just the way it's written is a little, and it makes it sound like they're protesting while sitting at their desks, also taking calls.
No.
And so I'm just trying to understand.
You'd be, if you're working 9 to 5, right, you'd be walking off the job during that 9 to 5 period. Right now, informational pickets are, of course, allowed there, and I think state employees do that on occasionally. But this would be, not doing your duties as mentioned there. Yeah.
And so under the current rules, if somebody walked off the job but also took a personal day, is that allowed?
If they walked off the job and also.
Well, I mean, if they're just like, I'm not going to work today because there's a protest that I want to take part in, and I'm allowed to not go to work today due to some PTO, CTO kind of situation, are they precluded from doing that because they're a state employee?
Yeah, my assumption is you might want to get a legal Beagle's take on this. If it's a personal day, that time is your own. I don't know if you'd be able to do it on the grounds of your workplace or anything like that. But yeah, certainly you can.
Yeah, no, at some point it would be good to understand just in a little more kind of plain English what the existing statute functionally prohibits, because when I read it, it is slightly abstract. So,
Sure.
But
and I'll admit I don't really have strike experience, right?
Because, right.
Yeah, it wasn't covered.
And I think that my experience with the teachers is that most strikes are related, most if not all the strikes I've experienced or read about are related to contracts.
Impositions, yeah.
And impositions and the conversations that we've had about whether someone should have the right to impose or the right to strike. Mm-hmm. It's the idea that you're both staring over the abyss that no one really wants to go down. And this is different, or the description of what, when you say a work action, this is something, when you're using an example of a poisoned building that.
Yeah, no, sure.
We had this with the Pink Lady next door as well, had VOCs had to have its carpets replaced at one point, probably 10 years ago. And same, what you're saying is that state employees, as a rule, can't band together, take time and just end work.
Yeah, and this would not interfere with the collective bargaining process. Under CELRA, at least with VSEA units, we had what was called last best offer, right? You go through the motions of negotiating a contract with the state, and at the very end, the labor board would pick one of the 2 last best offers in their entirety. So it's not quite the same as, an employer imposing a contract, as you would say. So I think you highlighted a good point there.
And then also, I think when it comes to, what the strike, I won't go into it because we'll get into territory that we would need witnesses for and ask those questions. But no, any further questions for Representative Casey? I keep saying that, Representative Casey. It's so strange.
It's strange for me too. Strange for me too. I never hated a politician more than myself. Thank you very much for having me.
It's like it's calling me Mr. Stevens, and I keep going, that's my dad.
That's my dad. Hey, have a good weekend, everybody. Cheers.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you.
All right. Contact Representative Mulvaney Stanek.
I just sent a little nudge to her committee.
Can we just tap on the walls or whatever?
I can go, boy. No, I'll go pop. See if she's there.
So I noticed flowers were completely blocking representative.
That what?
That the flowers were
Flowers.
blocking representative. We noticed that.
On the camera?
Had a schedule, how exciting on a Friday.
It's a prelude to Good Friday.
Hey, here we go. I assume you would like me to sit here. Ready? Okay. Still frozen from standing outside, so hopefully I can warm up and.
Yeah, just take a breath and do you need to be co-hosted or are you just reading from?
I am just reading some notes today.
Okay, great.
Low key today.
All right. Well, welcome.
Thank you.
You are here to discuss H 297, which is quite similar to 292. And we just heard from Representative Hooper about an act relating to providing workers' compensation coverage for post-traumatic stress disorder suffered by certain state employees. His said public employees.
Yes.
So we've got a gist, but please share.
Great.
Bill, thank you.
Thank you, Chair Stevens. For your record, I'm Representative Emma Mulvaney Stanek, represent Chittenden 17. And yes, I'm here to just walk you briefly through H 297. And I didn't read Representative Hooper's bill completely, but I think mine is obviously more narrow in its proposal of who within state government to expand the presumption rights under workers' compensation for. So this workers' compensation bill, as we know, we have other categories of workers where we have the presumption that due to the nature of their work, if they develop PTSD, they don't have to have the burden to prove that their PTSD was generated from another source, and indeed because of the stress of their workplace. So given what has been happening in the political times through which we've been all living through, and especially in the last couple of years, or probably several years now, public sector workers have really been under attack. It's almost like kind of open season on folks who are on these front lines dealing with folks who not only are purposely attacking public sector workers, state government workers, federal government workers, but also are experiencing increased trauma from the pandemic and other sources. The folks who interface with these members of the public within our government are just in a more precarious and heightened space these days. So the categories proposed in the bill are very specific to try to really narrow who are most impacted by these kind of increased hostile environments that people are working in. And so corrections, for example, when we see people who are dealing with the challenges in society, these folks are often then winding up in our corrections facilities, and the folks who are working with those individuals are not only experiencing the trauma that often has put these folks into our incarceration system, but they are also witnessing the trauma that these folks are experiencing, and even experiencing trauma themselves as people are acting out and either not being treated for their own PTSD, et cetera, and it's causing sort of a spillover effect onto the employees working with them. In corrections, I'm sure we've heard testimony in House Commerce around the impacts of the workforce, but there's just an high increased level of trauma. And the University of Vermont did a study, I believe this was last year, where 30% of corrections officers in the Springfields facility reported considering attempting suicide in the last year, and that's 30%, and that was triple the response from the prior year. So all is not well when we look at our corrections workers and what they are facing in their workplaces. The psychological impact is real and it's increasing, and we need to pay attention to this. The bill proposes a few other categories, much kind of in the same vein, just to clarify what those are. The dispatch actually I should pull up the bill, but the one category are the folks who are sort of the answering points of dispatch or 911 calls. And they hear it all. They hear the trauma that people are experiencing when they're answering phone calls and trying to get people help. And so that's on a daily basis of being exposed to that. The Vermont Veterans Home is another category. And as we know, patients who are often experiencing or needing to get the support, medical support at the Vermont Veterans Home, have, again, their own PTSD. So when things are escalated, again, the staff really supporting those folks are also experiencing that trauma, impacting their own mental health. And for the Vermont Vets Home, it's been going on for years. My father used to be the president of the SCA a million years ago, it feels like, at least 10, if not 20 years ago. And I remember him telling me stories when he was first president and going around the job sites and realizing what all is not well at the Vermont Vets Home. And so that's been going on for many years. Another category are the sheriffs and state's attorneys, the classified employees there. And so these would be people ranging from the deputy state's attorneys to the victims advocates and even to the administrative assistants who write up the documentation of all of these cases and these court filings. And as you can imagine, those folks are experiencing trauma out in our communities when they interface into the court system. The employees having to, again, time and time again, hear the stories, hear the witnesses, hear the trauma of all shapes and sizes. It really compounds the issues of what people are experiencing and navigating for their own mental health and well-being. So the basic premise is that we do a presumption element for workers' compensation already for a couple other categories of workers under state law, firefighters, for example, and police officers. So this would be extending that to really reflect the realities for which these public sector workers are experiencing. And with all respect to Representative Hooper, narrow it really to those who I think arguably are experiencing their own PTSD just from the fact that they have to be state employees facing this kind of working condition, and that the least we can do as the state of Vermont is offer them this ability to access workers' comp without the burden being on them as an employee to prove that the PTSD indeed came from their workplace and not from another part of their life. So that's it. Easy bill.
In the case of corrections, I mean, I attended the dinner at the SCA with the corrections workers, and out of the much stress was described just in the nature of the work and the nature of the issues that have been happening with corrections forever. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that stood out to me was that there were plenty of corrections workers who were pulling mandatory overtime. They may have worked for 14 days straight for 12-hour shifts where, meeting up with family in the parking lot for changes of clothes and a hug of their children. I mean, there was, anecdotally, it was above and beyond. So I'm trying to say there's the experience of working within the building, but then there's the experience of having to work in the building, which are two slightly different things, right? It's your manager, it's your employer who's saying you have to work.
Yes.
Mandatory overtime. Is that, I guess this isn't specific to the bill as much as it might be to your experience and knowledge of as a contributing. I would have to, I'm making an assumption that might be soft pedaling it. I'm making an assumption that that's a contributor to PTSD. I mean, working anywhere for 14 days straight.
Well, it does not help at minimum. I mean, if anything, it compounds it. If this is your livelihood and your employer is telling you it is mandatory because we don't have the staffing that we should, and you need to come in and work, that's a power dynamic that's very hard to navigate and say no to. And then to be further exposed by a double shift or whatever the right terminology is, it really compounds the issue. And I just want to say, this doesn't solve it all. Like, I just want to name for the record, there's a lot more we need to do to support state employees in all their workplaces. This workers' comp piece is one small piece because not everybody uses workers' comp. We have to do better by the working conditions in general for state employees, corrections in particular. So this is one piece of it, though.
But so the reason this is in our committee and not your committee.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
I think it's because this would change or could change a statute. It's that fine line between these are the rights any employee has, and you deal with workers' comp starting from the general phase to how is it being run between
Got it.
public, private. That's what I'm imagining. They never give me a reason why the bills get sent to any particular committee, but given the nature of what these two bills are asking for, it's clear that that we're dealing with stuff that comes right up to that line.
Yep.
And you deal with it after employment.
That makes sense. We implement the program, if you will, not us personally, but we deal with the rate, contribution, all that kind of stuff, the technicals. Yep.
Yes, Representative Howard.
Thank you. I want to say thank you for including the state's attorney's office as a former employee of the state's attorney's office. I can't tell you the number of times that we were threatened in person and by phone. And I literally kept a can of mace and hornet spray at my desk because, I mean, there was a glass window separating our office from the people in the waiting room, but it was frightening. It was really, truly frightening. There was one issue where someone came and was screaming and yelling and screaming and yelling, and I tried to calm him down, and one of the attorneys heard him in the back of the office and came out, and we finally got him calmed down. And another person threatened to burn down our houses. He knew where we lived. And I saw him out in public, and he came over to me and said, "I know who you are. I've been in your office." So, I mean, these things go on. DCF was downstairs from us, and they also got threatened many times and would send an email saying, "Watch out for this person is in the building." So it can be very traumatic. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, and Representative Howard, I'm sorry you experienced that. This is, this is again just showing how unwell and how much other work on the other hand, if we went upstairs to Human Services, we really need to do better to support our community members where it gets to that point where they thinking threatening a neighbor, threatening anyone for that matter is somehow the answer to ending their suffering or whatever, some other resolution. And I completely neglected, you see this in the bill, family services is another category I proposed. I knew I was missing one, but yes, for that very reason, yeah.
Thank you.
Further questions for Representative Mulvaney Stanek? Thank you for bringing this forward. If we have the opportunity we will have more labor-related bills, I think, from the Senate, but if we take a step further, we'll get a walkthrough and we'll look for, and then already if you can see, the number, the witnesses that it's not important what the number is, but just what the witnesses would be.
Yep.
Trying to figure out, I can just hear somebody saying, "Oh, this will be so expensive," or this will be something, we'll work it out. Great.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you.
All right.
Enjoy the weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.
Do we have, do we know about Senator Harrison yet?
Well, I had two I've sent messages to her assistant and get her back. I got a message about 15, 20 minutes she was on her way to the institution.
Okay, so let's take 10 minutes and just go off live now and be back at 2:05 and then we'll be done after these two bills. Hopefully we'll be done by 2:30.
What are we hearing about from Senator Harrison?